Hi, thanks for joining us. This is Marty Wilkinson with the PeaceGiver Project. This is my guest, Katie Hansen. And you can always find us at thepeacegiverproject.com, PeaceGiver Project at Instagram or Facebook. So, as you've seen in previous episodes, we go back and forth in a very open dialogue about domestic abuse. Today, I will be asking at least the first question. At what point, Katie, did you make the decision to get the police involved?
So it took me actually asking him to leave my house. And that's when, once I asked him to leave, that's when the manipulation and the verbal abuse got 10 times worse than I thought it could from where we were. And we started visitation with kids, right? So it was every other weekend or whatever else. He would use my children against me. So he would actually take my girls and drive to the park, and then he would call me and tell me he was going to leave my kids on the side of the road if I didn't do this, or he would leave my kids here if I didn't do this. And it got a lot worse, and mama bear instinct was, no, like I'm gonna find you. If I call the police right now, they're not gonna be able to do anything. Luckily, I had a very smart child in the back seat yelling at things that she could see as she was driving by, so I was able to save them for that. But there was a lot of other things that he was doing. It was actually one night at my house, and I can't remember the instance for real. I think he was there to pick up my girls, and we had an exchange of sleeping bag or something, and he attacked me, and then he went after my children, and he actually cornered my children in one of the bedrooms, and I ran up there, and it was me protecting my children, and then my oldest daughter standing between me and him, and she just said, no, you can't hurt my mommy. And as soon as I heard that, it was just like this, oh my gosh, what am I doing? Like, I can protect me, he can wail on me, like, that's me, but now you're involving these two innocent children that I never saw the manipulation and the abuse that he was putting on them, as well as myself. I took it all in. So as soon as I saw her realize what was going on and knowing that wasn't okay, that was like a holy cow. And I stood in between the two of them, and I called the police, and they were there. And after I called the very first time and I made that decision to do it, every single time after that was the easiest thing I've ever done. I'm pretty sure they knew my address and my name by heart because I had to call them so many times. But it's that first initial call that is the hardest to do. But once you do it, after that, it's easy. Yeah.
Why? What took so long?
For me to call them?
Right. I guess, but so so it was obviously children. Mm-hmm. Your children's involvement. Why didn't you do it before?
Because I didn't see it. I didn't see the manipulation for them, because he wasn't physically abusive to my children, right? And when you're in a situation, you really don't understand that there's so many different types of abuse. You don't. Right. You only ever hear of the physical abuse. Right. So when you're in the situation, and especially when you grow up, you're told that you're supposed to have this perfect family. And so I don't want to say it was a mistake, because it's not, but I had a child really, really young. So I felt like I was the black sheep of the family. So now here I am. I have this man who's raising my oldest child that's not his. We have this child together, and I have a family that I'm supposed to have. Even though it wasn't a conventional family and it wasn't what I was taught to be, it was still a family. So I didn't understand that just because they weren't physically abused doesn't mean they weren't emotionally abused. Right. So, and I know that there were times that he had yelled at them, or my oldest daughter would say things to me, and I would just say, no, he doesn't mean it. And again, I was protecting him because I was being manipulated as well. There was a time he came home in the middle of the night super intoxicated, and this before my youngest was born, And he made me go into my daughter's room, I think she was 2 or 3, and tell her that he was not her father. He says, either you tell her or I tell her. So I went in a bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning and woke up a 4-year-old girl to tell her this man is not your father. I mean, she doesn't really understand at that point, especially in the middle of the night. But I didn't see it as abuse because it wasn't physical.
Right.
So it really just took my oldest daughter standing in between the two of us for me to realize that this really is a deadly situation.
Yeah.
And if something were to happen to her in front of me, I wouldn't be able to control myself, and that's not safe. And my kids will never see me that way.
It's interesting. So my little guy was the impetus of my leaving as well. Mm-hmm. It was we were already separated, but when I had finally made the phone call to have her reported, it was, I just wanted to keep my little boy safe. Mm-hmm. And it was a little shocking to me afterwards why I couldn't do that sooner for me. You know, the shame, and, you know, we could go for days on childhood trauma, and it's definitely, you know, we haven't went down that rabbit hole with you. We have somewhat with me, and it was there, you know, the shame and the low self-esteem. I felt like I kind of deserved some of it, a lot of it, you know, like, oh, well, I did this, and I made excuses, and, well, I'd been abusive in the past, so I deserve to be abused now. You know, I owe this to her to stick through this. And then it wasn't until my little guy got involved, I was like, man, the buck stops here. And that's part of the reason why I am so adamant about not attacking abusers or having, even to the victims or survivors, because if I have to convince a survivor that their spouse is a horrible human being that's irredeemable, that's going to take a lot longer than to just say, hey, is this unhealthy? Mm-hmm. Is this, you know, this isn't normal. You know, kind of like get out the pool. This is not normal. This is bad. And because I couldn't do it for myself, and it would surprise me if that wasn't a fairly common thread. Mm-hmm. And then you've got people who don't have kids at all, that happens with. One thing that I did think of when you had said you called the police, in my case, because I had committed an act of domestic violence, you know, multiple, you know, even throwing a phone, people don't, any physical act where you are, and trust me, I've become a bit of I'm speaking to the folks watching, I've become a bit of a student on domestic abuse, and anything that falls under a physical form of intimidation, that falls under the umbrella of domestic violence, mm-hmm. including breaking a phone, mm-hmm. because that's sending a message, well, I'm going to control. I'm going to keep you from reaching out, from getting help, from dialing 911, for whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And that's spooky, and I'm sure that's more prevalent out there, and that probably happens more often than, you know, someone laying hands on somebody else. You know, you throw a phone, and that happens, you know, the throwing stuff happened with me. My mom saw, you know, she probably thought I was Jackie Chan, the way I was dodging stuff. It's funny, it's kind of funny now, but it's not really funny. But probably my biggest form was the threats. After that first call was made, if I didn't do what she wanted to, she threatened to call the police on me. Mm-hmm. When I hadn't done anything. She called her friends. I hadn't done anything, and I was sober. And she called her friends and said, hey, he's doing this. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I didn't do anything. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how common that is, but my only point in any of that is I'm not that concerned on who leaves. Generally, you know, someone's got to go. There's got to be some space created. And whether they work it out or not, that's, I reckon that's up to them, but at least get the wits about them. And I'll talk about that more in my transition, because that was integral for me. When I finally got help, I was away from her for months. I was an intensive outpatient, and it wasn't until then I was able to, not only was I sober, but I had some time away where I could get clear, and I'm like, holy smokes. And I had people around me that were safe and objective, and they weren't attacking me. They weren't my family, because my family, I love my family very much. They sometimes had a tendency to attack me. Sometimes they had a tendency to attack her. And because I loved this person, it didn't really matter who they were attacking. My natural response was to defend. So that's exactly what I did, and that just lasted. It exacerbated the situation. It lasted even longer. We'll talk about that. We'll probably save the recovery process for another day, because that's a really super long conversation. So when you say you had you called the police, how many times do you think you called the police before you actually decided enough was enough?
So I actually called the police the first time was after we had already separated. So after I had already kicked him out. There was a time frame. It's super blurry to me that I guess we tried to work things out. And the manipulation was so good that I was like, okay, but I'm going to let you stay over there. But you can stay with me sometimes, and we'll see if it'll work. So there was a time frame after I had kicked him out that we actually tried things again. And then things got really bad. And that's when, after I called him that first time, I probably called him 10 times, and it got really frustrating to me. And I respect police officers, and I respect their job, and I know it's really hard, and they have to hear both sides or whatever, but having somebody come in and just hand me a piece of paper and say, well, he's got to go that way, call this card, they'll help you. When really, I'm like, if you leave, I could end up dead.
Yeah.
So that was really, really hard for me. And it actually took me, he attacked me on the side of the road, and he totaled a car. It was this big, huge thing. And he actually attacked me on the side of the road. And it was the next day where I went and got a protective order. And it was really easy to get. It was very hard to go get, because you have to have all this evidence to be able to show. You can't just walk in and say, hey, this person's abusing me.
Right.
So I had to have, I had pages and pages of text messages. I had pictures of guns that he had sent me. He would tell me the same thing, that he was going to kill me, or he was going to kill himself, or he made me pull the trigger, or whatever.
Yeah.
And I showed that to them, and they got me a protective order. But unfortunately, protective order is just a piece of paper.
Right.
People don't care. So it took another time. He threw a huge rock through my front window, and I had cops search my house with guns drawn, with my kids asleep at 4:00 in the morning, and then him show up 2 hours later, completely hammered, in my front porch.
Jeez.
That took him to jail because I had the protective order. That's finally when a cop looked at me and told me, he says, do you have any defense? And I said, no, I have a bat by my bed. And he told me, he says, you need to get a gun to protect yourself. And that was like, oh my gosh, this is a serious thing. Like, I could really die because this guy is so obsessed with me at this point. So it was very intense for a really long time. But he ended up going to jail for a year because of it.
No kidding.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how many parallels, as we explore the story, how many parallels there are between both of our stories. My ex lived in Idaho, and she would call me in a 6-month period. She called me basically twice a month, saying she was too intoxicated to take care of my son. So I would have to take a last-minute flight up there and take care of my boy. But while I was up there, so I was away from home, and we were separated. And so, let's test it out. I'm like, okay. And I'm, I'm still kind of gun shy, PTSD. I'm like, I'm freaking out up there because I've got nobody up there. There's nobody to come and save me. And so she would make those threats, and there were several times I had to go to the hotel. I had to go to a hotel, and in her defense, there were, again, this is the strange toxic relationship. I would go up there sometimes and I would get drunk, and she would leave me in her house and go get a hotel. She would take my son. Yeah. I know, crazy stuff like that, but I did that because she was afraid, and I got, I would get drunk and I would start name calling, and it's horrible. The problem with, taking that first drink, or, even saying that first abusive word, is everything escalates so fast, and you don't know when it's going to trigger. You don't know when it's going to snap.
Yeah.
And I didn't snap. But she couldn't take that chance. So she left because, she had obviously PTSD. I had to hurt her. I broke her hip. And when I tackled her, I broke her hip. And, it was horrible. And so I can see why she would do that. And it got to the point to where, she would, it wasn't until I went through those courses, I think I'm fairly certain I was the only one paying attention. I wouldn't raise my voice around her. I stopped raising my voice around her at all, because even raising my voice would send her to that dark place. When I realized how real that was. Did you experience any of that?
Where I had some, what do you mean, experience? What
Well,
part of
in
it?
terms of PTSD, I found out that I couldn't even raise my voice around her without it jarring her, and I found that I was going through the same, because if she raised her voice around me, I was afraid she was going to call the police on me, because it had been threatened so many times. What has been your experience with that, and what have you done about
For the PTSD side of it,
Right.
for me? It's been hard. The PTSD side, you never really think to yourself that that's something that you'd ever go through, right? You don't understand that that's something that really is connected to abuse. And it didn't make sense to me for a couple of years after the fact, because nobody explains that to you. So, of course, I did the whole jump into another relationship after we got divorced or whatever, because I wanted security or whatever. I was afraid. And I found myself having certain things that were said, certain comments, or certain loud noises, or it was the tone. It was a loud voice that was really, really hard. And even just up until recently, maybe 2-3 years ago, if anybody screamed at me or yelled at me or got super close in my face, that was it. I was done. I didn't care really what happened. There was something in the back of my mind that was just like, oh shit, you gotta run. This is gonna be bad. So it screwed up a lot for a lot of years. It's 5-6 years that it took me to figure out that that's what it was, and to understand why it is the way it is. So there's a lot. There's a lot. But mostly just the voice and the tone. Yeah.
I got that. I haven't actually done there's and I need to look up the EMDR is the acronym. It's basically reprogramming.
Mm-hmm.
It's becoming much more prevalent nowadays, in the psychology community. My brother, the only reason why I know about it is my brother, not the only reason, but my brother is qualified. He's a psychologist here in Utah, but he told me that he used it and it's been proven effective. There are several things, and they've even done MDMA, if you can believe it, with veterans to battle PTSD, to rewire. And my only point to that is, I'm not saying anybody should go use drugs. And so you're like shaking your head. That's a horrible idea. But in this context, they were actually using it. Doctors were prescribing it. It was monitored. It was very tightly used, and that's it. All I'm saying is that there are ways to get help for that specific thing, and it's not something that anybody should be ashamed of. It's something that was done to you. In my case, one of the hardest things about doing this project at all is it's one thing to come forward and say somebody hurt me, and it's something else to say I was the one that did the hurting. I was the one that was in that moment. I was the bad person. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. Nobody wants to be a survivor of abuse, and I can tell you nobody wants to be the poster child of domestic abuse either. I certainly don't, and evidently I'm the first, and so it stands to reason. But it's not that it's pretty, but it's not. There's a solution, and we can only get better if we talk about it. Thank you for spending time with us today. You can find us at PeaceGiverProject.com or PeaceGiver Project on Instagram or Facebook. Have a fantastic day.